Hello lovelies, I'm TrueCrimeCaitlyn and welcome back to my channel and another true crime case. If you're new here, welcome and thank you so much for joining us. If you're interested in true crime, please make sure to subscribe and to hit the little bell button so that you'll be notified every time I upload a brand new true crime case. I also cover true crime over on my TikTok account. You can find the link for that in the description box below. Today's case is about a man who was Wales's first recorded serial killer. A man who evaded justice and a man whose case made history. This man murdered at least 3 teenage girls in the 70s and it took investigators almost 30 years to catch him, but it was too late. Today we're going to be talking about Joseph Kappen, aka the Saturday Night Strangler. Before getting into today's crime, I'm going to tell you all about today's killer and his life so that you can have a little bit of background and a bit of context about the type of person that he was. Joseph William Kappen was born on the 30th of October 1941 in Port Talbot, Wales. He was one of 7 children born into a family with a broken marriage. By the time Joseph was 5 years old, his parents had divorced, and from what I could gather, he was mostly brought up by his stepfather and there wasn't a whole lot mentioned about his mum. From an early age, Joseph was getting into trouble with the police. At age 12, he was committing petty crimes, and by the time he was in his very early 20s, he had over 30 convictions for things including car theft, petrol theft, assault, burglary, and this meant he spent many years in and out of prison. A woman later recalled a time when she and Joseph were about the same age and were in a youth club when she had witnessed Joseph push another boy down the stairs for no apparent reason, just showing that he had very aggressive tendencies. When he wasn't behind bars, Joseph really struggled to hold down a job. He was a long distance lorry driver for a bit, and then he was a bus driver, and then he was a bouncer for some time as well. He smoked cannabis and it's believed that he also dabbled in selling it as well. Along with cannabis, Joseph smoked a ton of tobacco. He would smoke up to 20 rolled up cigarettes per day, and it was said that the smell of smoke was just thick around him. He wasn't a great drinker, and when he would go to the pub, he would usually have no more than 2 or 3 drinks. He never mixed with people, he never chatted with anybody. He was very much a loner and was very reserved. Despite this, he did manage to find love, and he would marry a 17-year-old Christine Powell in February 1964 when he was 22 years old. Later, talking about Joseph, Christine said that she had really fell for him when on one of their dates he had bought out a hot chocolate to warm up her hands. This was in a time when not a lot of people had any money to their names, a lot of people were quite poor, so his generosity in buying this drink for her, along with the kindness of him thinking that this drink will warm her up, just made her really attracted to him and made her really fall for him. They didn't get a whole lot of time together as newlyweds, as only 10 days after the wedding, Joseph was again arrested after he had burgled someone's house attempting to steal a gas meter. Not long after his incarceration, Christine found out that she was pregnant with their first child, and she would go on to have a healthy baby girl named Deborah. I couldn't pinpoint exactly when, but at one point during his sentence, Joseph was granted a day release to attend his grandfather's funeral, and he was chaperoned by a prison guard. This prison guard obviously wasn't watching Joseph well enough, as at one point during the wake, he dragged Christine upstairs and raped her, which is something she would sadly experience many times in the upcoming years. From this rape, Christine fell pregnant with their son Paul. Now, some sources do call him David, so I don't know if it's a middle name or if one of them's a middle name or whatever it is, but most sources do call him Paul. So Joseph was now a father to 2 children that he had never met from behind bars. When he was eventually released, he and Christine would go on to have one more child, and they had a baby girl named Beverly in 1974. Beverly was the only child that Joseph had any sort of bond or even the slightest soft spot for, presumably because he had been in prison for a good portion of Deborah and Paul's early life. It was said that Joseph very much ruled his family with fear and that he would go to extremes in punishing his children. One incident of this was when he kicked Deborah and Paul out of the house after they had eaten some biscuits. He demanded that they would go and scrounge for more biscuits to replace the ones that they had eaten. This was on a cold, wet and windy night, and he didn't let them back in the house until about 11 o'clock at night. Now bear in mind, both children are under 10 years old at this time. Another time where Joseph had traumatized and terrified his family was when they were out walking their family dog, when out of nowhere Joseph just stopped and started to strangle the dog in front of his kids, eventually killing it. He justified murdering their family dog by saying that it was getting too old. This just showed that Joseph had no regard for life and that he didn't even consider how this would make his kids feel. I mean, he's literally just murdered their pet in front of them. For many years, Christine put up with being physically, mentally and verbally abused by Joseph. She was raped by him at least bi-weekly, and finally in 1980 she built up the courage to leave and divorce him. As well as being an abusive, cruel, horrid father and a rapist, Joseph was also a paedophile. It was apparently quite well known where he lived that he liked to pursue young girls, and he would use his old jobs to do that. When he was a bus driver, he would use his breaks to go and walk around Landarcy, scope out and approach young girls. When he was a bouncer, he would flirt with the underage girls that were trying to get into the clubs. It's believed that Joseph was responsible for the attempted rape of 2 young girls in February 1973. These girls were hitchhiking, which was extremely normal at this time, and they got picked up by a man. One girl sat in the front seat and one girl sat in the back, and off they drove. This driver took them down an isolated road before pulling up, stopping, turning to the girls and saying, quote, "I know you want it," before he lunged at the girl in the passenger seat, grabbing her breasts. Her friend in the back tried to interject and tried to stop him from doing this when this man just turned around and punched her square in the face. The girl in the back seat thankfully managed to unlock the car door using her long fingernails, and she bolted out of the car, opening the passenger door, allowing her friend to escape on the way. When describing the man who picked them up, the girls described someone who very much resembled Joseph, but this report never fully made it to the police properly, as one of the girls was scared that she was going to get in trouble off of her dad who worked for the church. If it was Joseph, he would have been in his 30s doing this. After his divorce with Christine, Joseph did manage to get into another relationship with a local barmaid named Sandra Wyatt. Throughout their relationship, he sparsely left the house and was very poorly, suffering from lung cancer. He was deteriorating and eventually had to rely on a wheelchair to get around. He died on the 17th of June 1990 at 49 years old. It's the 17th of July 1973 and a man is out walking his dog down a quiet road in Tonwa, which is a village in Port Talbot. It was a quiet, normal Tuesday morning when this man noticed something lay in a drainage ditch. He initially thought that it was some sort of mannequin, so he went closer to take a proper look, only to find out that it was the body of a young girl. Her body wasn't really hidden and was just kind of lay in the water at the opening of the drainage ditch. When police arrived, they saw that she had a very big kind of black, blue, purple bruise on her jaw, which showed them that she had been in a very intense struggle, and it was apparent that she had been strangled using her own skirt. The victim was identified as 16-year-old Sandra Newton. She had been on a night out on the 14th and witnesses remembered seeing her in a pub having a very heated argument with her boyfriend. The couple bickered for some time when she stormed out of the doors, and she was closely followed by her boyfriend, and this is one of the last times that she was seen alive. Obviously this boy became police's prime suspect and they set out to find him. When they did, he profusely denied any involvement with Sandra's murder whatsoever. He did say that yes, they were arguing in the pub and yes, he did follow her out, but when he caught up to her, they made up, they had sex, and then they went their separate ways, and that was the last time that he saw her. Back at the scene, there was next to no evidence to be collected. Sandra's body was found laying some water, which is a problem in itself evidence-wise, and it had also been raining, which likely washed away even more evidence. The only thing that officers could really find was a tyre print on the road. Now, like I said earlier, this was a very quiet road, so it was very safe to presume that this tyre print was from the killer. However, if they believed that this tyre print was from the killer, this kind of contradicted their belief that the killer could be Sandra's boyfriend, because he didn't have a license, he didn't drive, and he didn't have a car. Where Sandra was found was a bit of a distance from the pub where they had last been seen, and it was relatively isolated, so how would our boyfriend have got her there without a car that he didn't own? Investigators took a mould of the tyre print and matched it up to a Dunlop tyre, which was a pretty common tyre brand, so this lead wouldn't get investigators far in identifying their killer, unfortunately. Sandra's murder rocked the community, who had never experienced anything like this before. Where they lived was considered relatively safe, and the community were very close-knit, so no one could fathom how something like this could happen to a young girl. However, 6 weeks later, Sandra's murder would sadly be overshadowed and put to the back of many people's mind when 2 more young girls are found dead in Landarcy. It's the 16th of September at around 10 AM when a pensioner is out on a walk in a wooded area nicknamed the Copse. This is just off the slip road of the M4, which is in the process of being built. It's here that he finds the bodies of Pauline Floyd and Geraldine Hughes, 2 friends who had worked together in a sewing factory and who were both only 16 years old. Pauline was found lay face down with her underwear partially removed, kind of towards the top of the copse. She had a ligature tied around her neck, which was either a 7-foot rope or cord. The ligature was also tied around some nearby foliage, which would tell investigators that she was murdered where she lay. Her brown suede bag was found just next to her feet, with a partial footprint on it where the killer had stepped on it with their muddy shoe. Geraldine was found around 100 yards away from Pauline, which suggested that she had tried to escape and run away from her attacker. It was found that Geraldine had tried to run in the direction of her dad's workplace, but unfortunately the killer had caught up to her, dragged her back into the copse where he beat her, raped her, and then strangled her to death. During the struggle of trying to escape, Geraldine had dropped her jacket, and beside it investigators found a full footprint of a size 9 shoe. Although this is just a small piece of evidence that can't really help in identifying the killer, this piece of evidence actually told investigators a lot about their killer. It told them that the killer was likely a man because of the size of the shoe, and that the killer was working alone. After doing door-to-door inquiries, police were able to kind of piece together some of Pauline and Geraldine's final night. They had been at a night out in Swansea, attending a disco in a popular nightclub which was named The Rank. They left between 1 AM and 2 AM to try and hitchhike a lift home. This was really their only option because buses didn't run that late and taxis were really expensive. A taxi would set them back about £4 and they only made £16 a week working at the sewing factory, so hitchhiking was the cheapest option. But as I mentioned earlier, hitchhiking was a very ordinary thing to do. South Wales Police launched one of the biggest manhunts in their history to search for someone that the press had dubbed the Saturday Night Strangler. Now, it is a little bit unclear, but at this point I'm pretty sure that police hadn't tied together Sandra's murder with Pauline and Geraldine's murder. It wasn't linked yet. Over 150 detectives worked on the case and thousands of police constables were enlisted to help gather information. They hung posters telling people not to hitchhike, that it was leading to murder, and the community were very distressed that this killer was out there somewhere. A few days into the investigation, a man named Philip O'Connor gave police their break. He told them that he was driving home at around 2 a.m. on the 16th when he saw two girls who he now believes were Pauline and Geraldine in a bus stop with their thumbs out trying to catch a lift, when a white Austin 1100 kind of swerved in front of him and picked both of the girls up. They drove side by side for a little bit and eventually were both stopped at some traffic lights. So Philip kind of peered over to the car and he saw both of the girls, but then he also saw the driver. He described the driver as being a well-built man who had bushy hair and a mustache, which in the 70s is quite a vague description. This description could probably match a lot of men in the community, but it was all the police had. What investigators really focused on was the car. They had a colour, a make and a model. So they set to work trying to track down all of the white Austin 1100s in the area, and the police constables were told to flag all of them down and get information from the drivers. They thought that if the girls had been in the car, they would have left some sort of fibres from their coat or their clothes. So they took over 10,000 samples from all different white Austin 1100s and sent them to the lab to be compared for testing. Samples were not taken by every car, however. If the driver could prove that he either wasn't in the area or wasn't driving that night, then they didn't take any samples from his car. One man who this applied to was a local man named Joseph Kappen. When investigators went to his home to question him, they saw his white Austin 1100 on the drive, but it had no tyres on and it was up on blocks. He told investigators that he wasn't driving his car on the 16th and that it had actually been off the road for some time because it had a faulty engine, and that he had spent the whole night of the 16th watching TV with his wife. Christine corroborated this for him, and she would later say that this was the natural thing to do should police ever ask her anything. Again, Joseph is a criminal, so speaking to police is something that's not unusual for Christine. And she was intimidated by Joseph into just agreeing or corroborating with whatever he said. Based off what I told you all earlier on about their relationship, you could probably imagine what would have happened to her if she had not gone along with what he was saying. Despite following all the leads that they had and combing through thousands of files, the case gradually began to go cold. And by the end of 1974, there were only a handful of officers working the case, up until 1975 when all the case files were stored away. The case wasn't officially closed because it was still unsolved, but I think now it was just very sparsely looked at. Throughout the years, as technology did begin to progress, they would go back to the evidence to see if there was anything that they could get from it or anything that they could do with it. In spring 1998, a forensic scientist successfully managed to extract DNA from semen that was left on the underwear of one of the girls. And this was huge for the case, as with this DNA, they could find their killer. It took a further 2 years to kind of separate the male DNA from the female DNA, but when that was successfully done, they were able to run the DNA through the national database. When they ran the DNA, investigators held their breath. This could be the moment they get a name, and this could be the moment that they get justice for these murdered girls. But sadly, there were no matches. In 2001, Pauline and Geraldine's case was reopened, and a small team of about 4 or 5 men worked on it under the name Operation Magnum. They had 35,000 suspects and they had to get to work on narrowing it down to only 500 and then investigating those. I don't know what the criteria was for them to decide to eliminate one person and then investigate the others, but they got to work reading through every single page of reports, combing through all the paperwork and going down every single suspect alphabetically. It took them 8 months, but they did eventually come down to 500 suspects. When they had their 500 name, investigators got to work going to track down all these men to find them and then ask for a sample of their DNA to rule them out. They tracked down men who were living up and down the country, they were living all over, and it was said that not one man refused to provide a sample. They had tracked down and eliminated 199 men until they came to the door of their 200th suspect, which was Joseph Kappen. His wife answered the door and had to inform officers that Joseph had been dead for over a decade by that point. So his name was taken and put into something called a dead pool, which was just another list where all the names of the deceased suspects went. During the time Operation Magnum were investigating and reopened the case, their interest in the media kind of re-peaked as well, and they began with their own theories. One of the most popular ones was that infamous killer Fred West was involved with the killings, as at one point he had stayed in proximity to where the murders had happened, but his DNA ruled him out. While investigating Operation Magnum, came across some reports about an unidentified rapist, and they believed that this rapist was the same man as their killer. A surviving victim from the rapist had told police when she initially made a report that she was attacked from behind and beaten before the rapist had threatened her, saying, quote, "Don't scream or struggle or I'll kill you." He would rape this poor young girl both vaginally and anally after binding her hands so that she couldn't protect herself. After raping her, he would watch her kind of quiver in fear on the floor, and then he masturbated, enjoying seeing this young girl terrified. He told her, quote, "Don't open your eyes. I'm going to have a cigarette and think about whether I'm going to kill you." She said that he wore a balaclava, so she didn't see his face, but she knew that he had a mustache, and she said that he absolutely reeked of tobacco. Now, remember earlier on when I said that it was very well known that Joseph smoked a lot of tobacco, and he also reeked of it all the time. In late 2001, South Wales Police went back to that forensic scientist who had managed to extract the semen DNA from either Pauline or Geraldine's underwear with another really old case that they had, to see if he could do the same again and help them out with this one. This was Sandra Newton's case, the first victim that I had spoke about today. It was still kind of believed that her boyfriend was responsible for her murder, and I don't really understand why they wanted to go for his DNA, because he did admit that they had had sex, so his DNA will be there. But like I say, I don't really know what they were thinking behind that, but they asked this forensic scientist to check for DNA anyways. When he managed to successfully extract semen DNA from Sandra's underwear, he found that there was 2 different DNA profiles from semen. One matched Sandra's boyfriend and one matched the DNA of the killer from Pauline and Geraldine, and this is when their murders were officially linked. Back at the start of the investigation in 1973, police theorised that their killer could have been someone who wasn't local to Llandarcy or Port Talbot, because there was a lot of industrial work, and like I mentioned earlier, the M4 was being built, so a lot of people were kind of coming and going. But now they had the same killer for both of these murders. This kind of cemented for them that the killer was a local man. The Operation Magnum team decided to do something new. This was something that had never been done before and was actually quite controversial of them to do. They decided to try and see if they could get a familial match from the DNA that they had. When you have a child, the child gets 50% of your DNA and then 50% of their other biological parents' DNA. So investigators are thinking that if the killer had children and their children got in trouble, their DNA would be on the database and they would be able to kind of track and get to the killer that way. This was still brand new technology, and like I just said, this was something that had never been done before, so it wasn't a quick or easy process to do. It was found that the killer had some sort of abnormality with his chromosomes, and when that was put through the database, 9 other profiles matched as having the same abnormality. There were 9 names, but only one of them had a familiar surname. The surname was Kappen, matching to Paul Kappen, who was a car thief. At the time of the murders, Paul was only a child, so it was very unlikely that he was the culprit, so that led them to his father, Joseph Kappen. The team knew that Joseph was their man, but without his DNA to make it absolutely certain to get a 100% match, they didn't believe that this would hold up in court, and they didn't really want to go to the parents of Sandra, Pauline and Geraldine without being 100% sure that they had their man. So this is when they made the decision to exhume his body. Joseph being exhumed in order to get a DNA sample to prove his guilt was yet another first. This had never been done before. On the 17th of May 2002, they began exhuming Joseph's body. It was said that this was a very nice, calm, quiet day with blue skies, but when they came to Joseph's coffin and began to exhume it, suddenly a storm came over them. When they removed his coffin, a massive crash of thunder just came out of nowhere. Many people believe that this was Joseph from beyond the grave telling them that he didn't want to be moved, and many people believe that this came because they were unearthing evil. When his coffin was opened, Joseph was still wearing a pair of trainers which was size 9. And if you remember, they found a shoe print at the scene of Pauline and Geraldine's murder, which was a size 9 shoe. DNA was taken from his femur and a tooth was also extracted from him. 3 weeks for the results to come back, and when they did, it was a perfect match. Joseph was their killer. Sadly, it was much too late to bring Joseph to justice and make him pay for his crimes. However, now the parents of Sandra Newton, Pauline Floyd and Geraldine Hughes had their answers and they could start getting some closure. It has been thought that Joseph is responsible for many other unsolved murders and rapes, like some of the ones I mentioned in today's video, but none have been proven. As I mentioned earlier, he did work as a long-distance lorry driver for some time, so he could have been anywhere in the country doing awful things. Joseph was the epitome of a violent, dangerous man. He preyed on defenseless young girls who he believed couldn't fight back, couldn't defend themselves, and done the worst things. I'm so grateful that we have this DNA technology and it was around so that the families of Sandra, Pauline and Geraldine were able to get their answers. And that is today's case. Thank you all so much for sitting and listening with me today. I have linked all of my social media in the description box below if you would like to follow me on any of my other platforms. I have also linked all of my source material down there too. If you're not already subscribed, please make sure to do so and hit the little bell button so that you'll be notified every time I upload a new video. And yeah, thank you all so much again for sitting and listening with us and always supporting my videos. I appreciate it so much. So yeah, thank you all again and I will see you all on my next one.